Deep in the Polish countryside, buried beneath tons of earth and rubble, lies one of World War II's most perplexing and dangerous secrets. A massive, bell-shaped object so extraordinary that governments have spent decades trying to keep its existence hidden from the public eye. And what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about Nazi Germany's final desperate scientific pursuits. This is the story of Die Glocke, the bell, a machine so advanced, so theoretically impossible, and so terrifying that even now, more than 80 years after the fall of the Third Reich, the world's most powerful nations continue to guard its mysteries with classified documents and official denials. When we begin our journey into this shadowy corner of history, we must understand that what we're exploring exists in that murky space between documented fact and historical speculation, between declassified intelligence reports and conspiracy theory, between what we know and what governments desperately wish would remain unknown. The Nazi bell wasn't some crude, experimental weapon cobbled together in a mountain bunker by mad scientists in leather coats. It represented something far more sophisticated, far more ambitious, and potentially far more destructive than most people realize. We're talking about a project that allegedly consumed millions of Reichsmarks, employed hundreds of the Third Reich's finest scientists and engineers, and operated from 1943 until the very end of the war in complete secrecy, hidden away in a mountain fortress so remote that even many high-ranking Nazi officials never knew it existed. The bell's story begins in the depths of the Second World War, when Nazi Germany faced an increasingly desperate military situation. The Soviet advance from the east was relentless. The Western Allies had secured a foothold in France, and the skies over German territory had become a nightmare of Allied bombing campaigns that reduced entire cities to ash and devastated industrial capacity. It was in this context of mounting desperation and technological ambition that the Nazi regime began investing heavily in what would today be called black-budget science projects, programs so classified and so compartmentalized that even the generals commanding the armies had no idea what was happening in the secret research facilities hidden throughout the Reich. One of these facilities was allegedly located in the Gaderska Mountains in what is now Poland, where a project codenamed Kronos, or sometimes referred to as Wunderwaffe, experimentation was supposedly underway, operating with resources and personnel that rivaled major military programs. The project's leader, according to declassified testimonies and survivor accounts, was a man named Dr. Walther Gerlach, a brilliant physicist who had already made significant contributions to quantum mechanics, and who, in the final years of the war, found himself heading up one of the most ambitious and secretive programs in the Nazi scientific arsenal. Gerlach was not a fanatic or an ideologue. He was, by all accounts, a serious scientist who was faced with an impossible choice: cooperate with the Nazi regime or face the consequences that such refusal would entail. Consequences that could include imprisonment, execution, or harm to his family. Working alongside Gerlach were other brilliant minds, including Georg Ricke, a weapons designer, and various other engineers and physicists whose names were either lost to history or deliberately scrubbed from the historical record by governments interested in keeping the project confidential. The project that consumed their efforts was something that the Nazis called Die Glocke, literally, the bell, and accounts from those who glimpsed it describe a massive, metallic, bell-shaped apparatus that stood approximately 9 to 10 meters tall and weighed around 13 tons. Constructed from an unusual metal alloy that survivors insisted was unlike anything they had ever encountered in their professional experience, the bell's purpose remains the central mystery that has haunted historians, conspiracy theorists, and intelligence agencies for decades, a question that governments have apparently decided should remain unanswered. According to the limited testimony that has been gathered from survivors and former Nazi scientists, The machine was designed to manipulate gravitational fields, a revolutionary concept that, if it worked, would have been decades ahead of any other nation's understanding of physics, and would have represented a fundamental breakthrough in our understanding of the universe. The theory suggests that the bell operated on principles derived from the work of various theoretical physicists who had been researching the nature of gravity and electromagnetic fields, incorporating concepts that wouldn't be seriously explored in mainstream physics for decades to come, suggesting the Nazis possessed theoretical knowledge in advance of their time. The machine allegedly operated by creating a field of some kind, possibly through the rotation of mercury or some other exotic material at extraordinary speeds, possibly through the manipulation of electromagnetic energy in ways that our current physics barely understands. When the machine was activated, according to accounts from multiple independent witnesses, it produced extraordinary effects. Witnesses describe an eerie green glow emanating from the apparatus and surrounding area, a strange humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire mountain facility, and effects on the surrounding landscape that included the sudden death of plants and animals within a certain radius, as though the very fabric of nature itself had been disrupted. One account, provided by a Polish engineer named Igor Witkowski, who spent years investigating the Bell story and interviewing survivors decades after the war, describes what happened when the machine was tested. Animals placed in carefully controlled proximity to the bell would simply expire, their bodies showing no obvious signs of trauma, but manifesting instead a kind of biological disruption that defied conventional explanation and suggested cellular damage at fundamental levels. The implications of such a machine, if it actually existed, were absolutely staggering. It could theoretically be weaponized to create zones of death from which nothing living could escape. It could potentially be developed into a military application, capable of devastating entire regions or cities without the indiscriminate destruction of conventional weapons. Or most horrifying of all, it could represent humanity's first successful manipulation of gravity itself, a technological leap that would have fundamentally altered the course of human history. The Nazi regime, for all its evil and moral bankruptcy, was not ignorant of science. Indeed, it had access to some of the greatest scientific minds in Europe, many of them pressured or coerced into service to the Reich through various mechanisms of control and coercion. The question becomes, why would they invest such enormous resources, financial, material, and human, into a project like the Bell, if it was merely a fantasy or a dead-end scientific endeavor that was clearly impossible? The answer lies in understanding the peculiar desperation and ambition that characterized Nazi science in the final years of the war. When the regime's leadership began to grasp that conventional military means would not be sufficient to achieve victory, or even to secure a negotiated peace, as conventional military options began to fail, and as the Nazis suffered one defeat after another in both the Eastern and Western theaters, the Nazi leadership became increasingly interested in what they called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, revolutionary technologies that might reverse the tide of the war and snatch victory from the jaws of seemingly inevitable defeat, technologies that might devastate the enemy so completely that the war would be won despite all the military and logistical advantages that the Allies possessed. We know definitively that the Nazis pursued numerous black projects and secret weapons programs during the war, including advanced fighter aircraft designs that were decades ahead of contemporary aircraft, rocket technology that laid the foundation for post-war space programs, nuclear research that progressed further than most people realize, and biological weapons programs that were conducted in various secret facilities throughout the Reich. Many of these programs achieved disturbing levels of advancement before the war ended, and some of them were captured by the Allies and Soviets and incorporated into their own post-war weapons development programs. So the question isn't whether the Nazis were capable of pursuing exotic physics research in complete secrecy. The question is specifically whether the Bell project existed as described, and what it actually was in concrete terms. The evidence that something was happening in that Polish mountain facility comes from multiple sources, though, admittedly, these sources are fragmented and often contradictory, which is precisely what we would expect if governments had intentionally worked to obscure the historical record. We have accounts from Polish workers who were forced to labor on construction in the region, testimonies from former Nazi officers who mentioned the project in post-war interrogations when they were being questioned by Allied and Soviet intelligence officers, and various documents that have surfaced from Soviet and Allied archives, some of which have been declassified and made available to researchers, while others remain restricted. The Polish engineer, Igor Witkowski, who spent years investigating the Bell story with meticulous attention to detail and cross-referencing of sources, interviewed an engineer named Jakob Spur, who claimed to have worked on the project, and who provided some of the most detailed descriptions of what the Bell looked like and how it allegedly operated based on his first-hand observations and professional expertise. According to Sporer's testimony, which has been documented in interviews and in the historical record, the Bell consisted of a large cylindrical chamber or vessel containing what he described as two counter-rotating cylinders, or drums, essentially drum-shaped structures, filled with what appeared to be mercury, or some similar liquid metallic substance that would conduct electricity and respond to electromagnetic fields in ways that contemporary scientists did not fully understand. When the machine was activated, according to his account, these cylinders would spin at extraordinary speeds that Sporer struggled to describe with precision, generating a field of some kind that Sporer himself struggled to describe in conventional terms, using language that suggested it was something beyond his ability to fully comprehend or explain to those without direct experience. The machine's effects on the surrounding environment were dramatic and deeply disturbing according to all accounts. Metallic objects exposed to the field would develop strange crystalline structures that had not been present before exposure. Materials would become brittle and transform in ways that seemed to violate ordinary physical laws and defy conventional physics, and organic matter, whether plant or animal, would simply expire, as though all the vital processes had been suddenly shut down by external intervention. The energy requirements for such a machine would have been absolutely enormous, potentially requiring megawatts of continuous electrical power, and accounts and fragmentary evidence suggest that the Nazis were attempting to construct some kind of massive electrical generation system to power it, possibly tapping into geothermal energy sources in the mountains, or constructing immense power facilities dedicated solely to running the Bell and supporting its operations. By 1944, the project had allegedly reached a critical stage where it was approaching some kind of climactic test or demonstration, and the Nazi leadership was reportedly planning tests to determine once and for all whether the Bell could be weaponized or potentially even deployed in actual combat situations to affect the course of the war. But then, in 1945, as the Soviet forces closed in inexorably on the facility, driven by their offensive operations from the east, something happened that would shroud the Bell in mystery and confusion for the rest of the 20th century and extending into the present day. According to various accounts from survivors and from fragments of documentation, the Nazis conducted a final test of the Bell, and the consequences of that test were allegedly catastrophic in ways that shocked everyone involved. Witnesses describe an enormous explosion, a blinding white light that could be seen from considerable distances away, a strange humming sound that affected the mental state and psychological condition of everyone within earshot, leaving some survivors with lifelong psychological effects, neurological damage, and changes to their mental state that conventional medicine could not explain or effectively treat. The facility was then destroyed, allegedly by the Nazis themselves, to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands, and to prevent the Soviets from capturing the technology intact and potentially studying it or reconstructing it based on what remained. Or some accounts suggest that the facility and much of its contents were destroyed in the explosion itself, when the bell malfunctioned during the final test. The survivors were scattered to the winds. Some were captured or killed by advancing Soviet forces. Others escaped into the confusion of the final months of the war, and the documentation about the project was either destroyed in the blast or scattered to the four winds, dispersed across various locations, and picked up by different parties. But here's where the story takes on a deeply unsettling dimension that raises profound questions about what happened after the war and where the technology that was allegedly being developed went after the fall of the Nazi regime. The Soviet Union apparently captured significant portions of the Bell project, including crucial technical documentation, blueprints, engineering specifications, and according to some accounts, the actual machine itself, or at least enough of it remaining to be scientifically analyzed and studied. Intelligence reports from the American government, particularly from military intelligence officers and CIA operatives who were working in the immediate aftermath of World War II to gather intelligence about what the Nazis had been developing, indicate that there was a desperate race to recover the wreckage and documentation related to the Bell project, a race that the Americans were keenly aware they might be losing to the Soviets. The Americans were acutely aware from their own intelligence gathering that the Soviets had access to vast stretches of Eastern Europe where Nazi facilities had been located, and they feared that Soviet scientists might exploit the advanced research that the Nazis had conducted, incorporating it into their own weapons development programs and gaining technological advantages that would be difficult to counter during the emerging Cold War. What happened to the Bell after the war is where the story becomes even murkier and more contentious, splitting into several different possible narratives that are contradicted by various pieces of evidence and testimony. Some accounts suggest that the machine or its remains were transported to the Soviet Union, where it was studied in classified laboratories deep within the USSR, possibly incorporated into Soviet research programs exploring advanced physics and the weaponization of exotic phenomena and force fields. Other accounts claim that the machine was actually captured by American forces operating in Germany in the chaotic final days of the war and was taken to the United States, where it was studied under the most stringent security protocols by American scientists working for various military organizations and for the emerging military-industrial complex that was being developed during the early Cold War period. Still other accounts suggest that both powers captured parts of the project, that the Soviet Union obtained some components and some documentation, while American forces obtained other crucial elements, with the result being that neither side ever possessed a complete picture of what the Nazis had developed. The truth is that we simply don't know with certainty, and that uncertainty is itself revealing and significant. It suggests that if something important was captured, governments would have every reason to keep it secret and to prevent the public from learning about it, particularly if the technology was deemed to have strategic importance. Consider the geopolitical situation in the immediate post-war period, a time when the world was transitioning from a global war against fascism into a new kind of conflict that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Nazis had allegedly developed a technology that could manipulate gravity itself, or at least something that created effects that looked like gravitational manipulation to the people who witnessed it, or electromagnetic effects so powerful that they resembled what gravitational manipulation might look like. The Soviet Union and the United States were transitioning from wartime allies to Cold War adversaries, locked in a competition for global influence and military superiority. And both sides would have been intensely motivated to recover, study, and if possible, weaponize any advanced technology that the Nazis had developed that might give them an advantage over their emerging enemy. The Americans had already shown their willingness to engage in extraordinary measures to obtain Nazi technology and to recruit Nazi scientists to work for American programs, the entire American space program, the development of American missiles and rockets, numerous advanced aircraft and weapons systems, and various other advanced defense initiatives were fundamentally built on the foundation of capturing Nazi scientific talent and Nazi technology at the end of World War II. Project Paperclip, the American program that recruited former Nazi scientists and engineers to work on American military and space programs in the years following the war, brought dozens of high-ranking Nazi scientific figures to the United States, including Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who became the primary architect and driving force behind the American space program. So the idea that the American government would be interested in capturing and studying advanced Nazi science and technology is not speculative or conspiratorial. It's documented historical fact that is openly acknowledged and discussed in academic and government circles. The question about the bell simply becomes one of specifics. Did the bell actually exist as described? What was it actually designed to do? And where is any physical evidence of it currently located? The skeptics, and there are many among mainstream historians and scientists, argue that the bell was likely either a complete fabrication or a mythologized version of some actual but far less extraordinary Nazi research facility or weapons project that was much more mundane than the dramatic accounts suggest. They point out that much of the testimony about the bell comes from second-hand sources, that survivor accounts are inconsistent in their details and sometimes contradictory, that there is no contemporary Nazi documentation that directly discusses the project in unambiguous terms, with clear explanations of what it was, and that many of the claims made about the bell, that it could manipulate gravity, that it produced zones of death where organic matter would expire, are scientifically implausible or impossible given what we know about physics and the laws of nature. These are legitimate objections that any honest assessment of the bell evidence must contend with, and they cannot be dismissed out of hand or ignored by serious researchers. However, the skeptics also face their own difficulties and problematic aspects of their position, because they must explain why so many different sources, some of them independent of each other and operating from different motivations and backgrounds, would converge on broadly similar stories about this facility and this mysterious machine. They must explain why governments would maintain secrecy around something that skeptics claim never existed, maintaining classification for decades, and treating the subject with what appears to be genuine concern for keeping it hidden. They must explain why declassified government documents, including from American intelligence agencies and military archives, reference the Bell Project directly and mention the collection and analysis of Bell-related materials by American researchers. The truth, most likely, lies somewhere in the middle ground between complete belief in all aspects of the Bell story and complete skepticism that would dismiss it entirely as pure fiction. Something substantive was happening in that Polish facility in the Gdańska Mountains. The evidence for that conclusion is substantial enough that dismissing it entirely requires ignoring too much testimony from multiple independent witnesses and too many official documents that have been declassified and made available to researchers and historians. What that something was, however, remains open to serious question and scholarly debate. It's entirely possible that the Bell was an exotic but ultimately unsuccessful attempt at applying advanced physics concepts to weapons development, a project that consumed significant resources but ultimately failed to produce a working weapon or a useful technology. It's possible that it was a facility for researching advanced materials, science, or electromagnetic phenomena and their potential military applications, without specifically being designed to manipulate gravitational fields. It's possible that what witnesses described as gravity manipulation effects were actually something else. Electromagnetic effects, perhaps, or some kind of plasma phenomenon that they struggled to categorize with the scientific knowledge and terminology available to them at the time. But the very fact that the question remains unanswered after more than 80 years, that governments have been reluctant to release all the documents related to what the Nazis were doing with advanced physics research, and that persistent gaps exist in the historical records surrounding this project, speaks to something important about how governments handle classified scientific research and how they manage information that relates to potential weapons development. Consider the broader pattern of government secrecy. Governments routinely classify scientific research that has weapons applications for decades or even longer, keeping information hidden from public knowledge even when the research is no longer directly relevant to contemporary defense concerns. The Manhattan Project was kept secret from the American public and even from most of Congress for several years, and detailed information about the project continued to be classified for decades after it ended. Biological weapons research was conducted in secret by multiple nations in violation of international agreements and treaties, with programs like the American Biological Weapons Program at Fort Detrick and the Soviet program at Vektor and Sverdlovsk operating in complete secrecy for years. Chemical weapons development was hidden from public knowledge by various governments, and information about these programs continued to be classified long after they formally ended. Nuclear weapons programs and all the associated research into physics and engineering required to build them proceeded in secrecy for decades, sometimes for a century or more before significant information became public. Space programs operated with substantial classified components, and even now, many decades later, significant portions of space program research remain classified and unavailable to public inspection. Advanced aircraft development, from the U-2 spy plane to the stealth technology, proceeded in complete secrecy for extended periods. So the question about the Bell isn't really whether governments would hide the existence of an advanced physics research project. Of course they would, and they have done so repeatedly throughout history. The question is, what specifically was being researched in that Polish facility? And the answers we have are fragmentary, often contradictory, and contested among experts and researchers. What we do know, with reasonable confidence, is that Nazi Germany was pursuing advanced physics research in the final years of the war. That some of this research involved facilities that were hidden and heavily compartmentalized to prevent knowledge of them from spreading. That the Nazis were deeply interested in applying theoretical physics and advanced understanding of fundamental forces to weapons development, and that both the Soviet Union and the United States were keenly interested in capturing this research and the scientists involved after the war ended. We also know that many of the specific claims about the Bell's capabilities, gravitational field manipulation, creation of zones of death where organic matter expires, effects on surrounding materials that transform them in fundamental ways, exist at the very edge of what theoretical physics would suggest is possible, given our current understanding, or perhaps beyond it entirely. But we've learned throughout the history of science that yesterday's impossibility is sometimes today's breakthrough, and what seemed theoretically impossible in one era has often been achieved in later eras. As understanding advanced, the physics of gravity itself remains poorly understood even in our contemporary era. We still don't have a unified theory that explains gravity in the same quantum mechanical terms that explain the other fundamental forces of nature. Einstein's general relativity describes gravity geometrically as the curvature of space-time, but integrating it seamlessly with quantum mechanics remains one of the great unsolved problems in theoretical physics, a problem that has occupied the greatest physicists for more than a century without producing a complete solution. So while gravitational field manipulation seems far-fetched with current technology and with our current level of understanding, it's not a violation of the laws of physics as we currently understand them. It's simply something that we don't yet know how to do, something that lies beyond our current technological capabilities and perhaps beyond our current understanding of how to approach such a problem. That's a crucial distinction between impossible according to physical law and impossible according to current human technology and knowledge. The persistence of the Bell mystery, more than 80 years after the end of World War II, tells us something important about the nature of historical knowledge, about how governments handle classified information, and about the gaps that exist between what actually happened and what we, as a public, are permitted to know and to understand. It suggests that there are aspects of our own recent history that remain hidden from us, documented in classified archives but inaccessible to public scrutiny and investigation. Most importantly, it serves as a reminder that we cannot assume we know the complete truth about significant historical events, and that governments have powerful institutional reasons for keeping certain scientific research secret. Whether that research concerns technologies from the past or scientific capabilities being pursued in the present day. The Nazi bell may be a legend, but it's a legend built on fragments of documented evidence and credible testimony from multiple witnesses. And the very fact that governments continue to treat information about it with a veil of secrecy suggests that there is something to know, something that governments deem important enough to keep hidden from public knowledge. As we move forward into the future, more documents will likely be declassified through the ordinary process of document review and declassification. More testimony from survivors or their families may come to light as oral histories are collected and preserved, and perhaps eventually, we will have a clearer picture of what happened in that Polish mountain facility during the final years of the Second World War. But until that day comes, perhaps many years in the future, the bell remains a mystery, a shadow in the historical record, a reminder that there are secrets at the heart of our recent past, and that the full truth about what happened and what was discovered and subsequently hidden away by governments may not be something that those in power are willing to share with us, regardless of how much time has passed, and regardless of how much historical distance separates us from the events of the Second World War.